1938 Russia. In the dead of winter, a prison opened its gates for the first time, yet by sunrise, no one had emerged alive. Guards reported empty cells, corridors that seemed unnervingly silent, yet local rumors whispered of screams that lingered for weeks, faint cries carried on icy drafts, and shadows that moved against walls as if animated by unseen hands. Conceived under Stalin's watchful eye, the facility was meant to house political prisoners, dissenters, and anyone deemed inconvenient to the state. Yet what was intended as an instrument of control became a labyrinth of fear, secrecy, and untraceable disappearance. The innocence of hopeful detainees, men and women who had once believed in law, justice, or even survival, collided violently with the invisible machinery of evil wielded by those in power. Their ambitions, loyalty, and humanity were tested against forces that operated in darkness, both literal and moral. Historical documents, leaked memos, and survivor accounts hint at an environment deliberately designed to disorient, intimidate, and erase. Architectural plans reveal narrow cells, twisting corridors, and surveillance points that gave guards total psychological control. Workers involved in construction later reported strange phenomena: whispers echoing in empty rooms, sudden temperature drops, and a pervasive sense of being watched. Such accounts contrast starkly with bureaucratic records that frame the prison as efficient, orderly, and rational, a facade of control masking the human cost hidden within. Eyewitness testimonies recall prisoners who stepped through the gates with nervous hope, only to vanish into silence, leaving behind the faint scent of smoke, the clatter of keys, and the lingering echo of voices no longer human. This introduction establishes a central tension: innocence versus institutionalized evil. It asks whether the horrors were purely human, a product of state-sanctioned cruelty, or whether they were amplified by something ineffable, something beyond comprehension. The cells themselves, silent yet deadly, become a symbol of this duality, tools of punishment, or gateways to an unknown force that feeds on fear and obedience. The audience is invited to question morality, authority, and the limits of human understanding, as well as to consider the psychological impact of absolute power when wielded without restraint. By focusing on a single chilling feature, the emptiness that belied the terror inside, this opening primes viewers for a journey through human psychology, political ambition, and the unknown. Were these disappearances systematic executions, ritualistic enforcement, or glimpses into a reality that defied explanation? Perhaps they were all three. The story blends fact and legend, history and speculation, creating a labyrinthine narrative in which each revelation intensifies suspense. From the very first lines, the audience is pulled into a world where morality, authority, and fear intersect, forcing them to confront the unknowable consequences of absolute power, while setting the stage for the chilling stories yet to unfold. In the remote reaches of Russia, far from the eyes of the public and buried beneath a canopy of snow-laden forests, the foundation of a prison was laid under Stalin's direct orders in 1936. The decision to construct such a facility in isolation was deliberate. Secrecy was paramount, and the chosen land carried an air of forbidding history. Engineers and laborers worked in shifts, their progress meticulously documented, yet even official records hint at unease. The prison was not merely a building, it was an instrument of psychological domination as much as physical containment. Every corridor, every cell, and every observation post was carefully designed to maximize control, to strip prisoners of hope, orientation, and eventually, identity. The claustrophobic cells were barely larger than coffins, arranged in patterns that disoriented even the guards unfamiliar with the layout. Labyrinthine corridors twisted back upon themselves, and observation points allowed unseen eyes to monitor every movement. These features combined to ensure that prisoners could never rest, never feel safe, and never predict the fate that awaited them. Officially, the facility was meant to house political dissidents, intellectuals critical of the state, and high-risk criminals who threatened the regime's carefully maintained order. Yet the architecture hinted at ambitions that extended beyond practicality. Engineers were instructed to consider acoustics as much as structure, and some later noted odd reverberations that carried whispers unnaturally far, or created disorienting echoes that seemed to imitate voices. Foundations were dug into soil that proved unexpectedly unstable, causing repeated adjustments and reinforcements. Workers writing in diaries and letters often spoke of inexplicable phenomena: faint cries that seemed to come from no source, shadows that shifted in the corner of the eye, and an oppressive sense that the building itself was alive. These accounts, though largely suppressed, suggest that from the very beginning, human ambition interacted with something ancient and unknowable in the land itself. The site chosen for the prison carried a history long forgotten by official planners. Folklore spoke of the land as a place of punishment and secrecy. Centuries earlier, it had been used for executions, secret religious ceremonies, and gatherings deemed too dangerous or blasphemous for public knowledge. Villagers in surrounding regions recalled whispered stories of strange lights, sudden sounds in the forest, and the lingering sensation of eyes watching from beneath the earth. Although planners dismissed these tales as superstition, workers and guards could not ignore the unease that seemed to cling to the ground. In letters and diaries smuggled from the site, early laborers described waking to hear chanting-like echoes or seeing the reflection of figures that vanished when approached. Engineers trained to follow logic and structural science were confronted with phenomena they could not quantify or explain. Despite these eerie elements, construction proceeded with meticulous discipline. Blueprints reveal an obsessive attention to control, both of the environment and of human behavior. Corridors were intentionally narrow, limiting the ability of prisoners to move freely or communicate. Cells were stacked in ways that allowed for sound amplification, ensuring that even minor disturbances were immediately apparent to the guards. Observation towers and internal checkpoints created a network of oversight that functioned as much to induce psychological fear as to prevent escape. Each design choice was deliberate, yet early memos suggest that the planners themselves were uneasy. One officer wrote, "The place is too quiet. The silence is heavy, as though it waits." Such statements hint at a tension between rational planning and intuitive dread, a recognition that the structure might produce consequences unforeseen even by those who designed it. Psychologically, the prison's architecture mirrored the authoritarian ethos of the era. By confining prisoners in claustrophobic cells, disorienting corridors, and constantly surveilled spaces, the planners ensured that hope would erode over time. Historical studies of confinement show that such spatial control can profoundly distort perception, increase stress, and weaken moral and psychological resistance. The planners may have understood these principles intuitively, if not formally, creating an environment in which despair was as much a weapon as physical punishment. Letters from officers describe watching prisoners hesitate, confused by the layout, their attempts at orientation thwarted at every turn. Workers recalled that the building seemed to react to human presence. A sudden groan of timber here, a strange echo there, reinforcing the sense that the prison itself was a sentient presence. The human cost during construction was already significant. Many laborers fell victim to harsh winter conditions, accidents, or unexplained illnesses. Diaries and oral accounts hint at mysterious disappearances among workers themselves, which were often attributed officially to environmental hazards or fatigue. Yet whispers persisted that the land exacted its own toll, punishing those who disturbed its long-standing secrets. These stories contributed to an atmosphere of fear that would carry over into the prison's operational years, embedding itself into the collective memory of all who entered or lived nearby. The interaction of political ambition and structural hubris is evident in the obsessive secrecy surrounding construction. Workers were sworn to silence, and any mention of unusual occurrences was strictly forbidden. Guards and supervisors were instructed to report only progress, not perception. Yet the few accounts that survived hint at an intuitive recognition that the prison was more than brick and mortar. It was a mechanism for terror, designed to erode humanity at multiple levels. Some letters described sounds that resembled weeping or laughter when no one was present, shadows that moved independently of light, and a pervasive sensation of being observed. While rational explanation might attribute these phenomena to stress, fatigue, or suggestion, their consistency across accounts suggests a persistent, shared experience that defies simple analysis. Early officer correspondences reflect conflicting emotions: pride in fulfilling Stalin's vision, tempered by unease about the building's psychological effects. One memo noted that the structure functions exactly as designed, yet a subsequent letter added, "But I do not understand the voices that echo at night." Workers' diaries often echoed similar contradictions. The prison was both a triumph of engineering and a source of inexplicable dread. Some interpreted these occurrences as premonitions, others as manifestations of stress amplified by isolation and labor. Collectively, these accounts create a layered narrative in which human ambition, psychological pressure, and unexplained phenomena intersect, forming the foundation for the prison's later reputation as a place of vanishing, terror, and moral corruption. By the time the first prisoners were transferred into the facility in 1938, the construction phase had already set the tone for the horrors to come. The meticulous architecture, the strange acoustic properties, the uneasy foundations, and the lingering folklore combined to create an environment that was both a marvel of control and a crucible of fear. The prison's fate, whether as a site of human cruelty, supernatural influence, or an intersection of both, was in many ways sealed during construction. Every decision, from cell size to corridor twists to observation points, contributed to an ecosystem of psychological terror, ensuring that the individuals who entered would be tested beyond physical endurance. Workers, officers, and engineers could sense the weight of history and the presence of something older, darker, and unquantifiable lurking beneath the facility. Yet no one could predict how the prison's architecture would shape the disappearances, madness, and legends to follow. When the first prisoners arrived at the facility in 1938, the air carried a chill far deeper than the winter that blanketed the remote Russian landscape. They were men and women sent for minor political infractions, dissenting voices, or bureaucratic inconveniences. For many, this was their first encounter with an institution designed not only to contain bodies, but to erode spirit, hope, and identity. Families whispered of loved ones vanishing, yet official records insisted all transfers had proceeded without incident. The reality was far darker. Within hours of entering their cells, some prisoners disappeared entirely. Doors locked behind them and windows sealed as if by invisible hands, leaving only faint echoes of screams that clung to stone walls. The acrid scent of smoke, and the deepening sense of dread among guards and prisoners alike. Whispers spread quickly. Something within the prison devoured those who entered, or perhaps it was the human cruelty within these halls that magnified ordinary fear into legend. Eyewitness accounts, later smuggled into letters or recounted decades after the events, described shadows slipping along corridors where no light touched, voices speaking in tongues that none could understand, and objects moving inexplicably from one cell to another. One guard, identified only in fragments of testimony, recalled hearing footsteps pacing a corridor outside a sealed cell. Yet when he opened the door, no prisoner remained. The bed was empty, the clothing neatly folded, as if the person had evaporated into the air. Survivor accounts, though rare, paint an even more unsettling picture. Individuals experienced hallucinations, auditory phenomena, and unshakable feelings of being watched. The prison's design, claustrophobic, labyrinthine, and surveilled at every turn, intensified these psychological pressures, turning fear into a weapon as effective as any chains or locks. The contrast between the innocence of detainees and the machinery of institutional evil becomes apparent in the first documented cases. Many prisoners were ordinary individuals, clerks, teachers, minor activists, and those accused of thought crimes rather than violent offenses. They were thrust into an environment designed to strip agency and autonomy, and the psychological toll was immediate. Accounts from officers note that some detainees were rendered mute with terror, pacing endlessly in circles or talking to empty air. Others were found in collapsed states, murmuring incoherent phrases or recounting visions of figures taller than men, draped in shadows, whose presence seemed to enforce the prison's omnipotence. The effect on guards and staff was no less pronounced. Officers reported an almost palpable tension, a dread that seeped into their bones, and a growing reluctance to linger in the hallways at night. The very architecture of the prison created a feedback loop. Fear bred hallucination, hallucination reinforced fear, and both contributed to an aura of inescapable menace. Detailed case studies illustrate the depth of these horrors. On March 12, 1938, a detainee named Ivan Petrov, accused of spreading anti-state pamphlets, was placed in a solitary cell on the north wing. By evening, his cell was empty. Guards claimed they had not opened it. Only the faint scent of burning metal lingered, and the echo of footsteps paced back and forth for hours, leaving colleagues unnerved and questioning their own perception. Similarly, Maria Sokolova, detained for alleged subversive correspondence, was reported to vanish while moving from one observation block to another. Witnesses described seeing a shadowy figure slide along the walls ahead of her, almost guiding her path until she was gone from sight and sound. Such accounts, repeated across multiple detainees, hint at a phenomenon that could not be attributed solely to human action. The psychological toll was compounded by the prison's isolation. Communication with the outside world was strictly forbidden, and news of disappearances spread only through hushed conversations, rumors, and smuggled notes. Inmates began to internalize the terror, creating shared paranoia that reinforced the prison's grip. Guards themselves started to report seeing figures where none existed, hearing cries that vanished when investigated. These occurrences blurred the line between reality and perception, fostering collective hysteria. Did the prison consume its prisoners literally, or did the psychological environment amplify the natural horrors of confinement into the supernatural? Survivor testimonies suggest both possibilities, leaving historians and psychologists struggling to disentangle fact from legend. Historical context deepens the tension. The political climate of 1938 Russia was defined by fear, mistrust, and the omnipresence of state surveillance. Within this environment, the prison became a microcosm of totalitarian control, magnifying ordinary anxieties into life-threatening consequences. Accounts describe detainees attempting to navigate corridors with rigid adherence to rules, only to vanish without warning. The mechanisms of power, the guards, locks, and observation posts, were perfectly aligned with the institution's intended purpose: to erase individuality and enforce absolute compliance. Yet, paradoxically, it was not only human action but also the physical environment that seemed to exert control. Reports of inexplicable temperature drops, doors that could not be opened, and hallways that appeared to shift create a narrative where the building itself is a character, complicit in or actively enforcing the horrors within. As weeks passed, the pattern of disappearances grew undeniable. Each new detainee arrived with trepidation, acutely aware of rumors and prior events. Families received vague notices, while officers and laborers whispered about strange phenomena that defied explanation. Shadows grew longer, voices persisted, and even the hardened guards reported unease that was difficult to articulate. The institution's effect was cumulative, eroding sanity, hope, and resistance. Psychological analysis of survivor testimony reveals consistent motifs: a sense of being followed, visual distortions, auditory hallucinations, and moral compromise when survival required abandoning others. These repeated elements suggest both the intentional design of the prison and the amplification of innate human fears in extreme environments. By documenting specific cases, corroborated by dates, names, and surviving reports, the narrative draws the audience deeper into a world where innocence confronts systematic evil. Each account reinforces the central tension. Was this an engineered apparatus of control, or had something far older, darker, and inexplicable been awakened by the construction and operation of the prison? The first prisoner's experiences establish a foundation for understanding the subsequent psychological unraveling, the legends that would form, and the ongoing debate between rational explanation and the possibility of supernatural influence. The stories of Ivan Petrov, Maria Sokolova, and countless unnamed detainees create a tableau of fear, mystery, and moral complexity that echoes through the corridors even decades later. The section transitions naturally toward attempts at rational and psychological explanation. Engineers, journalists, and psychologists would later analyze structural anomalies, acoustics, and human behavior, seeking logical reasons for the disappearances. Yet, for those who witnessed events firsthand, no explanation sufficed. Shadows continued to move without light. Screams echoed without source, and objects shifted in ways that challenged reality itself. The first prisoner's experiences crystallized the psychological and moral stakes of the facility, establishing the tension between human cruelty, environmental influence, and forces that remain unquantifiable. By examining these initial arrivals, the audience is immersed in a world of fear, ambiguity, and suspense, setting the stage for the deeper exploration of science, superstition, and survivor testimony that follows. The first systematic investigations into the prison began with engineers, psychologists, and journalists arriving under strict secrecy, each tasked with documenting the source of the mysterious disappearances that had already taken root in both reality and rumor. Engineers examined the facility's structure, noting cracks in the foundation, microfractures in walls, and subtle instabilities that could, in theory, explain some of the strange occurrences. Acoustic anomalies were carefully measured, revealing how whispers could carry unnaturally far down the labyrinthine corridors, bouncing off stone and steel in ways that created auditory illusions. Toxic air pockets were discovered in select wings, where methane or carbon monoxide could accumulate and induce dizziness, nausea, or hallucinations. Yet, despite their findings, these factors accounted for only a fraction of the reported phenomena. Footsteps echoed in empty hallways, shadows slipped across corridors where no one stood, and intelligible whispers, often personal and threatening, resonated in ways that could not be explained by ventilation, echo, or human action. The more investigators documented, the more apparent it became that rational explanation alone could not encompass the full scope of events. Psychologists were equally perplexed. They focused on the effects of prolonged isolation, the oppressive architecture, and the environment's ability to manipulate perception. Prisoners, staff, and even construction workers reported visions that seemed to defy logic. Figures taller than any human, faces emerging from walls, and a pervasive sense of being watched. Mass hysteria became a recurring phenomenon. Small incidents amplified through rumor and fear spiraled into collective terror. Trauma manifested in hallucinations and panic, often affecting multiple individuals simultaneously. Confirmation bias reinforced this. Once a guard or prisoner expected to witness something unnatural, the architecture and acoustic peculiarities ensured that ordinary noises and shadows were interpreted as evidence of the inexplicable. Investigators meticulously cataloged these reports, aware that human perception was fallible, yet noting the striking consistency of certain events. Journalists contributed a third lens. Their documentation focused on the lived experiences of prisoners and guards, seeking patterns across anecdotal evidence. They recorded recurring motifs, shadows that seemed to move independently, objects shifting without explanation, doors that would not open, and hallways that appeared to distort space. The journalists' notes suggest a duality. The prison was both a physical site and a psychological amplifier, magnifying ordinary fear into extraordinary perception. Interviews with survivors and workers consistently described temperature drops that occurred in localized areas, lights flickering without cause, and sensations of presences that had no discernible source. These experiences challenged rational interpretation and pushed investigators to consider phenomena that straddled the boundary between the empirical and the mystical. Folklore surrounding the prison soon gained prominence. Locals spoke of the land as cursed, used for centuries for clandestine executions and arcane rituals. Rumors of spirits exacting vengeance, ancestors punishing transgressions, or divine forces intervening in the mortal realm circulated quietly at first, then more widely, as disappearances continued. Investigators initially dismissed these stories, yet their persistence and specificity, mentioning corridors, chambers, and rooms that corresponded precisely with structural peculiarities, added an unsettling dimension. Shadows that seemed alive, footsteps that followed prisoners in exact sequence, and whispering voices repeating private details were interpreted by some as evidence of ancestral or supernatural intervention. The collision of folklore with empirical investigation heightened suspense, suggesting that while science could explain some aspects, it could not account for everything. Religious interpretations provided yet another layer. Priests and spiritual advisors, called discreetly by officials or summoned by families, described inexplicable phenomena during brief visits. Shadows formed shapes resembling crosses or other religious symbols. Sudden gusts of cold swept corridors as if in judgment, and auditory experiences resembled chants or prayers in lost or forgotten languages. These accounts were framed as moral reckonings for systemic cruelty, aligning with folklore and rumor, but defying scientific verification. Some investigators began to consider that human malevolence alone could not explain the intensity and persistence of events, though empirical study remained inconclusive. The combination of psychological stress, architectural manipulation, and environmental anomalies created fertile ground for both religious and folkloric interpretations. Eyewitness reports were meticulously cataloged and remain some of the most compelling evidence of phenomena resistant to rational explanation. Prisoners described walls that seemed to shift or elongate, figures that appeared in doorways and dissolved when approached, and voices calling their names in perfect diction. Guards reported lights flickering with no electrical cause, cold spots that defied seasonal temperature readings, and objects moving seemingly independently of gravity. Some incidents were observed simultaneously by multiple witnesses, suggesting a shared experience beyond simple misperception. Attempts to explain these events through air currents, structural settling, or hallucination alone failed to account for the repeated, consistent patterns. Investigators noted that while some occurrences could be tied to human error or environmental factors, the persistence of the most unsettling events suggested that either human perception was stretched to its limits, or that something genuinely anomalous was occurring. The juxtaposition of rational analysis with superstition created an atmosphere of intellectual and emotional tension. Engineers emphasized structural causes, identifying potential hazards in floor stability, wall vibration, and acoustic amplification. Psychologists highlighted perception distortion, memory alteration, and trauma-induced hallucinations, arguing that stress could convert mundane stimuli into terrifying experiences. Folklorists and spiritual authorities emphasized historical and mystical dimensions, suggesting the land carried residual energy from executions, rituals, and political oppression. This multidimensional analysis produced a narrative in which the empirical and the speculative were inseparably intertwined, forcing the audience to dwell in uncertainty. Was the prison a mechanical instrument of human terror, or did it awaken forces beyond human comprehension? Ultimately, the investigations revealed a complex interplay of engineering, psychology, and folklore. The prison was a crucible, intensifying fear, trauma, and perception into phenomena that defied singular explanation. Science could account for structural and environmental anomalies. Superstition, folklore, and religious interpretation offered narrative coherence. Yet neither could fully encompass the lived experiences of prisoners and guards. Shadows, whispers, temperature anomalies, and inexplicable movement persisted, bridging the space between fact and legend. The audience is left to question whether these events were environmental, psychological, or truly anomalous, setting the stage for survivors' accounts, where intimate human testimony complicates interpretations and deepens the mystery. This tension between observation and belief, between science and superstition, creates the foundation for the narrative to move forward. The prison emerges as a multidimensional entity, simultaneously material, psychological, and possibly supernatural. By presenting a space where logic collides with legend, the audience is invited to navigate uncertainty, confronting the limits of rationality and the allure of the inexplicable. Survivors' testimonies introduced in the following section will humanize these phenomena, providing intimate insight into fear, moral compromise, and the ongoing struggle to reconcile experience with explanation. The few who emerged from the prison were forever marked, their eyes carrying the weight of horrors that defied straightforward explanation. Survivors recounted a reality where time, space, and logic seemed to bend, creating a world both physically confined and psychologically destabilizing. Many described hallucinations that were at once vivid and deeply personal. Shadows that mimicked human forms but stretched impossibly tall, faces appearing in walls only to dissolve when approached, and voices whispering secrets too intimate to be coincidental. These were not fleeting impressions. They were sustained, immersive experiences that eroded rational thought. In contrast to their previous lives as ordinary citizens, teachers, clerks, or minor political dissidents, these individuals now navigated a reality in which fear was constant, omnipresent, and inescapable. The contrast between their prior reasoned selves and the psychologically fragmented survivors underscores the impact of extreme confinement and authoritarian terror. Many survivors described the prison as a living entity, an environment capable of watching, responding, and shaping behavior. One former detainee, Alexei Morozov, recounted pacing the same corridor for what felt like hours, convinced he was being followed, yet when he turned, no one was there. The sensation of being observed was pervasive. Walls seemed to bend subtly to reveal or obscure space. Lights flickered without electrical cause, and temperature shifts occurred in precise patches, as though the building itself were breathing. These phenomena were frequently corroborated by other survivors, suggesting a shared perceptual distortion that went beyond individual psychology. Some guards reported similar experiences, footsteps echoing in empty corridors, doors that resisted opening or closed of their own accord, and fleeting glimpses of figures that could not be accounted for by ordinary shadows or light. Survivors' accounts frequently involved moral compromise, illustrating the ethical strain imposed by extreme fear. In certain instances, prisoners faced the agonizing choice of abandoning others to survive, witnessing fellow detainees vanish or endure torture, and making decisions that violated conscience but ensured personal survival. One survivor recalled leaving a friend pinned in a collapsing corridor to escape, only to return hours later to find the cell empty, the body gone, and no trace of what had occurred. The psychological aftermath of such decisions was profound. Guilt, shame, and self-doubt became lasting companions, intertwining with the physical and perceptual horrors of the prison itself. These accounts reveal the human cost of survival under extreme duress, highlighting how moral and psychological trauma intersected with environmental terror. Hallucinations were not confined to vision alone. Auditory distortions were pervasive and unnerving. Survivors described hearing whispers that articulated their own thoughts, or recounted names and actions they had never spoken aloud. Some reported hearing the echoes of footsteps in precise sequences, sometimes matching their own movements, sometimes diverging, creating the sensation of being simultaneously followed and anticipating a presence that was not there. The brain, under constant stress and isolation, seemed to create stimuli that were indistinguishable from reality. Yet the consistency of certain reports, repeated across multiple individuals and shifts of guards, challenges the notion that all experiences were purely psychological. The prison, survivors suggest, amplified both fear and perception, producing phenomena that were simultaneously internal and external. Environmental factors also contributed to the trauma, often in ways that were subtle but profoundly unsettling. Survivors reported corridors that felt impossibly long, cells that seemed to shrink or elongate, and rooms where temperature dropped sharply without cause. Drafts appeared in isolated patches, carrying the scent of smoke or decay, even when ventilation systems were operational. Lights flickered unpredictably, sometimes illuminating figures that vanished instantly when approached. These physical anomalies created a sense of unpredictability and instability, magnifying the psychological toll. Prisoners reported that the building itself seemed to respond to motion, anticipation, or fear, suggesting a fusion of environmental and perceptual distortion that rendered the ordinary extraordinary and the ordinary terrifying. Trauma distorted memory, blending environmental horror with psychological terror. Survivors often struggled to differentiate between what they had actually experienced and what their minds had conjured under extreme duress. Some recalled events that were chronologically inconsistent, while others recounted visions that felt hyper-real yet impossible. Despite this, patterns emerged across testimonies: the omnipresence of shadows, inexplicable auditory phenomena, moral dilemmas imposed by survival, and a persistent sense of unseen observation. These recurring motifs illustrate how personal horror coalesced into communal legend. Even as individuals struggled to articulate the full scope of their experience, their stories converged, creating a shared narrative of fear and incomprehensibility that would endure long after the prison's operational period. The intersection of extreme confinement, psychological stress, and the ambiguous environment produced profound moral and existential reflection. Survivors frequently reported questioning their own sanity, morality, and the boundaries of human endurance. Some described moments of decision in which the choice to act, or to fail to act, carried consequences that extended beyond immediate survival, affecting the perceived fate of others. The prison, in effect, became a moral crucible, testing not only physical endurance but the capacity for ethical reasoning under conditions of sustained terror. This moral dimension adds depth to the narrative, highlighting the complex human experience behind what might otherwise be dismissed as mere horror or legend. Personal recollections were interspersed with elements that seemed almost fantastical, yet survivors consistently described them with grave sincerity. Figures appearing in peripheral vision, hands pressing against walls with no visible source, and fleeting glimpses of rooms that seemed larger than architectural possibility were frequently mentioned. Some recounted interactions with entities that were human-like yet impossibly distorted, moving with a fluidity and purpose that defied natural explanation. While these accounts could be interpreted as hallucinations produced by fear, sleep deprivation, or stress, their recurrence across different individuals, time periods, and wings of the prison suggests a phenomenon that transcends simple psychological or environmental explanation. The narratives of survivors also highlight the enduring psychological consequences of these experiences. Even decades later, many exhibited signs of trauma: nightmares, hypervigilance, mistrust of authority, and obsessive attention to shadows or sudden sounds. Moral dilemmas and decisions made under duress continued to weigh heavily, demonstrating how confinement and terror had long-term, perhaps permanent, effects on cognition, emotion, and perception. The prison, survivors suggest, was both a physical structure and a psychological entity, capable of shaping behavior, perception, and moral choice in ways that extended far beyond its walls. In many ways, survivors' accounts bridge personal experience and communal myth. As stories circulated among families, guards, and later journalists, individual horrors transformed into a collective legend, blending the real with the uncanny. The prison became more than a site of punishment. It became a symbol of authoritarian terror, moral compromise, and the unknowable interplay between environment and mind. These testimonies set the stage for exploring broader theories, speculation, and unresolved truths, illustrating how lived experience complicates attempts to impose rational explanation or moral closure. Finally, survivors' accounts prepare the audience for the narrative transition to theories and myths. Their experiences, both tangible and uncanny, humanize the abstract discussions of science, superstition, and architecture that preceded them. By integrating intimate recollections with structural and folkloric context, this section highlights the psychological, moral, and supernatural dimensions of the prison. It emphasizes that the horror was not only physical, but moral, ethical, and perceptual, leaving the audience to question whether the disappearances were purely human-engineered, environmentally induced, or influenced by forces beyond comprehension. The accounts illuminate the tension between fact and legend, preparing the viewer to confront speculation, interpretation, and the chilling, unresolved truths that follow. Over the decades, the narrative surrounding the prison evolved into a dense tapestry of theories, speculation, and folklore. Researchers, journalists, and enthusiasts have attempted to explain the mysterious disappearances and unexplainable phenomena in ways that straddle history, psychology, and the supernatural. One of the earliest explanations proposed by insiders was that the prison had functioned as a site for secret executions, deliberately concealed from public scrutiny. Officially, prisoners were meant to serve time for political dissent or criminal activity, yet records are incomplete, inconsistent, or mysteriously absent. Surviving documents hint at unexplained absences, discrepancies in rosters, and orders to report detainees as transferred or escaped despite no corroborating evidence. Some historians argue that the bureaucracy of Stalinist Russia alone could account for inconsistencies, a combination of mismanagement, fear, and deliberate obfuscation. Yet the frequency, pattern, and strangeness of the disappearances suggest a deeper, more deliberate mechanism of control or elimination. Parallel to bureaucratic explanations, rumors of ritualistic or occult practices have persisted. Staff members, often speaking in whispers, suggested that certain disappearances coincided with nights of particular ceremonies, strange alignments, or esoteric symbolism embedded into the prison's design. Accounts describe rituals involving chanting, the use of fire or smoke in precise locations, and a hierarchy of participants whose identities remain largely unknown. Skeptics dismiss these claims as the projection of guilt, paranoia, or folklore onto a terrifying environment, yet the consistency of certain motifs, shadows, lights, the sense of being observed recurred in independent testimonies. Anthropologists and folklorists note that the region itself has a long history of ritualized practices, secret societies, and religiously sanctioned punishment, suggesting that the prison may have inadvertently inherited a space already steeped in cultural and mystical resonance. Cultural explanations also intersect with the psychological. Psychotherapists studying survivors note patterns of projection, confirmation bias, and collective memory shaping. Individuals exposed to extreme fear often internalize narratives that externalize threat and assign agency to environmental or supernatural factors. Shadowy figures, whispers, sudden chills, and inexplicable movement may originate partially in the mind, amplified by the oppressive architecture and authoritarian atmosphere. Yet these psychological analyses do not account for all phenomena. Multiple independent observers reported nearly identical experiences occurring simultaneously, suggesting that while the mind may distort perception, some events retain an external, reproducible quality. This ambiguity fuels speculation and ensures that no single explanation satisfies every observer. Debates between historians, psychologists, and paranormal enthusiasts highlight the tension between empirical evidence and narrative resonance. Historians emphasize documentary research, structural analysis, and the political context of Stalinist repression. Psychologists analyze trauma, perception, and environmental stress, explaining experiences as emergent phenomena of extreme confinement. Paranormal enthusiasts foreground folklore, spiritual resonance, and inexplicable occurrences, noting recurring motifs such as vanishing prisoners, shadowy presences, and auditory phenomena. Each camp offers partial insight, while leaving key questions unanswered. By juxtaposing these perspectives, the narrative demonstrates that the prison's horrors operate simultaneously in multiple domains: historical, psychological, and potentially supernatural. The audience is left to negotiate these layers, weighing evidence, plausibility, and the allure of the unknown. Comparative analysis further complicates interpretation. Similar disappearances in remote or authoritarian facilities worldwide suggest that the prison may not be unique. Reports from other Russian labor camps, as well as isolated detention centers in Eastern Europe and Asia, describe prisoners vanishing without trace, unexplained shadows, and auditory anomalies. Whether these patterns reflect common architectural flaws, psychological responses to oppression, or an underlying inexplicable phenomenon remains unresolved. The recurrence of motifs, vanishing individuals, shadows, and distorted perception, raises questions about systemic human behavior and the environment's potential to magnify fear and trauma. Viewers are encouraged to consider whether such events are isolated or symptomatic of a broader, darker pattern that transcends geography, culture, and historical period. Superstition and folklore retain a particularly compelling role in interpretation. Legends of ancestral vengeance, spiritual retribution, and curses embedded in the land intersect with modern accounts, blending past and present into a persistent narrative of dread. Stories suggest that the prison site was chosen intentionally to suppress or contain forces that predated Stalinist ideology, reflecting an uneasy continuity between cultural memory and political violence. The recurrence of shadows, flickering lights, and inexplicable movement aligns with motifs in Russian folklore regarding haunted or cursed spaces, where moral transgression and cruelty invite supernatural consequence. These cultural narratives frame the prison not merely as a site of punishment, but as a locus of moral and existential reckoning. Political intrigue and conspiracy theories further enrich the tapestry. Some researchers speculate that the disappearances were part of a covert mechanism to eliminate perceived threats to state authority, combining psychological terror, physical confinement, and untraceable execution. Leaked or partially destroyed documents suggest selective reporting, unexplained gaps in prisoner records, and administrative instructions that implicitly sanctioned secrecy. Within this framework, shadows, whispers, and environmental oddities could serve as intentional psychological tools, magnifying fear to enforce compliance and suppress dissent. The overlap between political control and alleged supernatural activity blurs the boundary between human agency and inexplicable forces, creating a space where morality, power, and fear intersect in ways that are both historical and mythic. Ultimately, the prison stories resist singular interpretation. Empirical investigation, folklore, and psychological study each provide insight but also leave gaps. The combination of architecture, extreme stress, political oppression, and cultural memory produces phenomena that are at once explicable and inexplicable, tangible and uncanny. The recurrence of motifs, vanishing prisoners, shadows, whispers, invites reflection on both human cruelty and the limits of perception. These overlapping explanations challenge the audience to engage actively, questioning which elements are rooted in fact, which in interpretation, and which may lie beyond human comprehension. By examining theories and myths together, the narrative prepares the transition to the final unresolved conclusion. Viewers are left in a liminal space, balancing skepticism and belief, historical documentation and folklore, psychological analysis and personal testimony. The prison emerges as a multi-dimensional entity, simultaneously historical, psychological, architectural, and mythic. The audience is prompted to consider whether the horrors were unique to this facility or part of a broader, unexplained phenomenon that echoes across time and space. The tension between competing narratives ensures that the mystery remains alive, compelling engagement, debate, and personal interpretation, even as definitive answers remain tantalizingly out of reach. The prison stands today as a silent sentinel, its gates permanently sealed, yet the stories that emerged from within continue to haunt the collective memory. Shadows and whispers linger in local lore, intertwining with fragments of historical record, survivor testimony, and folklore into a tapestry of uncertainty that defies resolution. Official documents enumerate hundreds of detainees who vanished within its walls, yet explanations are incomplete or contradictory. Some argue these were tragic accidents, the result of structural instability, mismanagement, or negligence under an oppressive regime. Others suggest deliberate executions carried out under the guise of bureaucratic secrecy, a chilling testament to the cruelty inherent in absolute power. Yet no explanation accounts for every disappearance, every chilling sensation described by those who lived through it, nor every shadow or flicker of light that seemed alive with intention. Survivors' recollections continue to shape the prison's legend. They describe corridors that stretch impossibly, voices that echo with uncanny familiarity, and the constant sensation of unseen eyes tracking every movement. Moral dilemmas. endured under extreme conditions, choosing survival over solidarity, witnessing violence, or making impossible ethical choices, leave indelible psychological scars. These human dimensions blend with inexplicable phenomena to create a narrative that is at once tangible and surreal, grounded in history, yet suspended in uncertainty. Local reports of flickering lanterns and faint cries emanating from the foundations suggest that the darkness may still inhabit the space, a reminder that some horrors cannot be fully contained or explained. The narrative closes unresolved, leaving viewers to grapple with tension between reason, morality, and the unknowable. Was the prison a product of fear, bureaucratic corruption, and human cruelty? Or did it serve as a conduit for forces beyond comprehension, predating human ambition and authority? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between, where human malice meets inexplicable phenomena, and perception itself becomes a tool for terror. The interplay between history, psychology, and folklore ensures that no singular interpretation satisfies every inquiry. The story resists closure, compelling the audience to engage with questions rather than answers. In leaving the mystery intact, the prison continues to provoke reflection, debate, and speculation. Audiences are invited to consider the ethical, psychological, and supernatural dimensions simultaneously, weighing evidence and intuition against folklore and testimony. The story's unresolved ending keeps the prison alive in imagination. A space where shadows linger, morality is tested, and human understanding falters. The silence of the sealed walls is matched by the echo of unanswered questions, ensuring the legend endures, haunting thought long after the video ends. The audience departs unsettled, challenged to confront the delicate boundary between what can be explained and what remains forever beyond comprehension.